about to begin, so I'd like to hand you over to my beautiful assistant. However, I don't have one, so I'm going to hand you over to Rachel instead. Rachel. It's a horrible thing to say. I'm only joking, really only joking. She's a wonderful person.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming to our talk. Dyslexia and Autism, an awesome alliance. We're going to be talking about three things today. We're going to be telling you all about autism and dyslexia first of all. Then we're going to be telling you how we work together. And finally, we're going to give you a few tips on inclusion that you can take away and start using right now. I'd like to start with a photo though. This is the edge of one of those panoramic photos. It was taken in my final year of university. There I am. And I didn't know I was autistic and had ADHD at the time. All I knew was that I struggled. But there I am, standing in line where I'm supposed to be. But if we scan over to the other side of that panoramic picture, there's somebody there who isn't supposed to be there. My final year photo was photobombed by this man. Why did you do that?
Basically the same reason I'm photobombing her presentation today. I did it partially because I hated authority. I'd spent most of my life being told I was wrong by authority and made to feel small by authority. And so, to me, when you're supposed to do something, you do the opposite. And that's what I've always done. And you try to be as creative as you can. Hence, photobombing somebody's photo and pulling stupid faces, even while I'm not supposed to.
I'll do this.
One of the reasons is that I didn't know I was dyslexic. And in fact, I was diagnosed late. I was diagnosed when I was 30, when I was handing in my master's degree, which is something I was really proud of. But it was only when I was doing my master's and everyone was telling me, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, that I realized maybe I needed to be tested.
I was really judgmental about dyslexics when this photo was taken. I judged people for not being able to spell properly or not using the right grammar. But the bad thing is about being judgmental is that if you're a judgmental person, you suffer much more than anybody else. I judged myself much more harshly than other people. I would say to myself, why are you always late? Why can't you be organized? What's wrong with you? And I've changed now. I'm not like that anymore. But back then, I was really judgmental.
And in fact, she's not alone. It's really interesting. If you're like me and nobody likes you, then you'll go onto dating sites, and you'll find that on dating sites, you're kind of stymied a little bit. There have been some surveys done. I think OkCupid did a survey where 50% of people put spelling mistakes as an unattractive feature, and it's likely to put them off dating somebody. I think it was eHarmony that did another survey, and 79% of people came out as judging you negatively and finding you undateable based on spelling and grammar. And this is because we don't judge the world as it is. We judge the world as we are. I love this photo. There's a giraffe painting a rather attractive woman, and all you can see is the hat at the top. We don't judge the world as it is. We judge the world as we are. One of the things we can do then is we can actually start to look at some of the definitions of how the world really is.
So here are some definitions of the conditions that we have. First up, and these are all official definitions, by the way. So first up, from the National Autistic Society, we've got autism spectrum disorder, a lifelong developmental disability which affects how people communicate and interact with the world. Sign me up. What's that about? I mean, it's true, but why describe autism like that? Why not describe it as autistics have brilliant attention to detail? We're really good at doing things properly. And we can see the beauty in the world, like a raindrop sparkling in the morning sunshine. How about dyslexia then? Here from the NHS we have, dyslexia is a common learning difficulty that mainly causes problems with reading, writing and spelling. Dyslexia is a lifelong problem that can present challenges on a daily basis. How much negativity is in there? Difficulty, problems, lifelong challenges. And again, I'm not saying dyslexics don't have challenges in those areas, but what I'm saying is, why can't you describe dyslexics as visual thinkers? People who create amazing art, people who can visualize data, who can see things in 3 dimensions in the ways that almost no one else can. And finally, we come to ADHD, because both Martin and I also have ADHD. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by excessive amounts of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity that are pervasive, impairing in multiple contexts, and otherwise age inappropriate. What does that even mean? What's age inappropriate? Is it like wearing quirky Dr. Martens when you're the wrong side of 40? Again, we've got all this negativity here. Instead of saying people with ADHD can hyper-focus, we can multitask, and we have 10 good ideas before breakfast. Now, all of us here, all of us in this room, we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses, right? We're all good at some stuff and we all suck at other stuff. But when you've got a condition like autism, like dyslexia, like ADHD, all you get is the negativity. All you get is people telling you how wrong you are. Should we do some myth busting?
Let's do some myth busting. Let's have a show of hands. Let's do some truths and falses. First of all, do you think it's true? Put your hands in the air if you think it's true that dyslexics can help adapt to climate change. Only 2 of you. Actually, there was some 3. There was some fascinating research at the end of last year that the dyslexic brain is peculiarly adaptive, and that actually dyslexic thinking can help the human race adapt to climate change. It's fantastic. Ask me later if you want to know where the research comes from. It's brilliant. Number 2, dyslexics hate books. Put your hands in the air if you think that's true. No, sometimes it's true. Mainly books hate me, rather than dyslexics hate books. But, you know, sometimes I love books. Absolutely love books. I don't read many of them, but I love them. So number 3, let's have a look at number 3. Dyslexics see words moving around on a page. True or false? It's not true. It's not true. It's something called Ehrlich syndrome. I'm going to explain what Ehrlich syndrome can look like. It's a visual processing issue. This is a completely still image. You may notice that it looks like there's movement. This is the kind of thing that Ehrlich syndrome feels like. I'm going to do another one. Anybody who has photosensitive epilepsy or suffers from migraines, please don't look at this next image. Probably nothing bad will happen, but I don't want to go back to prison if it does. So I'm going to ask everybody to focus on the center of this spiral. Nothing more than the center of this spiral. And I'm only going to ask you to focus on it for maybe 20 seconds maximum. As you're focusing on it, I'm going to ask you to give me your bank details. No, I'm not. No. I'm going to ask you to just keep focusing on the center of this image. Just focus, focus, focus. And in about 5-10 seconds, I'm going to ask you to look away, and I'm going to give you a specific instruction. So in 5 seconds, I'm going to ask you to look away, back at the piece of paper you had on your chair at the beginning. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, look at your piece of paper. It's quite spectacular. A lot of people will see it moving. They'll see movement in that piece of paper. And this is this visual processing issue. And this is what Ehrlich syndrome feels like. But it's not dyslexia. So let's have some truths and falses about autism.
Yeah. Okay, true or false? Autistics are good at science. Is that true or false? Raise your hand in the air if you think autistics are good at science. Well, yeah, lots of autistic people are good at science. And there is some evidence that autistic people are more represented in STEM fields, but it's kind of flaky evidence because it's only going with autistic people who are diagnosed, and as we know, a lot of autistic people are underdiagnosed. So there is evidence to say autistics are good at science, but it's not very strong. Next up, 1/3 of autistics are gay. Put your hand in the air if you think 1/3 of autistic people are LGBTQIA+. Yeah. It is incorrect. And we have Chris Bonello of Autistic Not Weird to thank for this next statistic. The actual number is 1/3 of autistics are straight. 1/3 of autistic people are straight. Yeah, it's a massive, massive amount of autistic people who are LGBTQIA+. There's a really big overlap. Nobody really knows why. And finally, autistics are sexier than normal people. Who thinks that's true? Yeah, it is. Yep. There was a study done in 2017 by Shuttle et al. That found that autistic people are more adventurous and imaginative when it comes to sex. Now, this is the workplace seminar theatre. So you might be thinking, what's this got to do with work? Well, it kind of depends on what your work involves, but the reason we do this bit is it's about breaking down some of those misconceptions that we all have about autistic people and dyslexic people. It's about looking at some of those myths and saying, oh, actually, that's not true. That's just a stereotype. Not all autistic people wear anoraks and go train spotting. We do cover a much broader spectrum of people than most appreciate.
So what we're going to look at very, very quickly is we're going to look at one of the major differences that there is between dyslexia and autism, and in fact, that vague, amorphous term neurotypicality in the middle. We're going to have a look at some of the differences. Thank you, Rachel. So, I've created a story called Three Worlds. Imagine a benign creator of the universe. And this creator of the universe created three worlds. The first world had lots of very small tower blocks, crunched really close together. They weren't very tall, but they were crunched really close together. The second world had not quite as many tower blocks. They were a little bit higher, and they were spaced a little bit further apart. And the third world, as you've probably guessed, had even taller tower blocks. There weren't as many of them, and they were spaced even further apart. Now, if you wanted to communicate with these tower blocks, and I'm going to ask Rachel to help. Rachel, here's a message. In the first world, you don't have far to run. Could you just go over there and pass it to the person next to you? You don't have far to run, and then you can pass the messages across, and maybe over there as well. And it's really easy to communicate in this first world. In the second world, there you go. You have a little bit further, about halfway up, please. You have a little bit further to run, and pass it a little bit further across. Thank you. And the messages go further across, and maybe another one as well, if that's okay. So maybe that side. There's no money in these envelopes, by the way, in case you were wondering. And finally, as you've probably guessed, in the third world, you've got even further to run. There you go. Even further to run, right to the end. And if you can pass them to the very ends of the rows, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. It takes a lot longer to get up these steps, and it takes a lot longer to pass the messages from one building to the other. Now, okay, what this does is, whilst Rachel's exhausting herself, what this does is it mimics something really interesting. It mimics what happens in a lot of organizations. You've got different types of communication. You've got what they call local communication, regional communication, and global communication. This is what you might call cross-functional communication. And we know from the statistics and workplace statistics, and this is from McKinsey & Company, 2019, cross-functional operations typically outperform less diverse operations by 30 to 40%. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask people to understand that the first world was the autistic world, the second world was the dyslexic world, sorry, the neurotypical world, and the third world was the dyslexic world. What do I mean? Well, Rachel, we've got some cabbages. Could you give a cabbage to that gentleman there? Could you stand up, please? Thank you. And can we have a volunteer from this front row as well? Thank you very much. Could you stand up and hold the cabbage? And what we have is we've got some chopsticks. Are they chopsticks? Barbecue sticks. Barbecue sticks. Over there we get barbecue sticks, and here we get some toothpicks. Can you put the barbecue sticks quite far apart on your cabbage, please? And can you put the little things really close together in clumps on your cabbage? What you'll notice is this person here and this person here, they're making wonderful examples of these three worlds. Wonderful examples of what the three worlds look like. Can you show them to the people in the audience? They don't have to be complete, it's okay. Perfect. Oh, beautiful. That's really nice. There you go. Round of applause. Thank you. You can keep the cabbages. That's your gift. You can keep the cabbages. Now, you may ask, why am I giving you a lesson in theology and cosmology when we're supposed to be talking about dyslexia and autism? Well, the truth is we are talking about dyslexia and autism. There is, oopsie-daisy, something that you have in your brain called mini columns. These are essentially little stacks of neurons. And they help information run up and down and jump from neuron to neuron. In the autistic brain, typically, the mini columns are quite small, they're quite short, and there's a lot of them packed quite closely together. In the neurotypical brain, whatever that means, They're a little bit longer, not as many of them, and they're spaced a little bit further apart. In the dyslexic brain, they're quite tall, not as many of them, and spaced even further apart. They're really quite, maybe 1.5 millimeters, something like that. This is why I've got curly hair, so you can't see them sticking up out of my head. And what this means is that when we communicate, when our brains communicate with each other, literally speaking, autistic people are able to focus and see details that other people might not. Dyslexic people have got this global view. So it's not just a metaphor. This is based in biology. And what it means is that typically speaking, dyslexic and autistic people come out in all the objective tests as objectively more creative than neurotypical people. How do we measure creativity? Well, we've just done it. There is something that you were all given, something to complete. What I'd like you to do is take what you've completed and show it to the person next to you. It's from something called the Torrance test of creative thinking. If your completed picture looks something along these lines, you belong to the vast majority of very normal people. Well done. You congratulate yourself. If, however, your completed picture looks something more like this, perfect. We got lots, almost exactly with a few of these, actually. If your picture looks a little bit more like that, oh, I love that one. You got a little person jumping out of a window as well. It means you are of the tiny minority of creative geniuses. And people with dyslexia, people with autism, invariably fall into this category of highly creative people. To illustrate creativity, Rachel's going to tell us a story.
Can I have the mic? Can I have the mic?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Thank you. So, a story. We're moving on to the second part of our talk now, which is about how autistic people can work together. And I wanted to give you a real-life example of this. And I thought to myself, as an autistic, when have I recently worked with a dyslexic person? And I thought about it, and I thought, it's staring me in the face. It's doing this talk. It's a really good example of how we can work together. And it's a bit meta, but it's real life and it's live. Anything you're enjoying about this talk is because an autistic person and a dyslexic person are working well together. Now, how did this come about? Well, Deborah emailed me and asked me if I come and speak at this show. And I really wanted to do a talk about autism and dyslexia because it's something that people don't really talk about that much. I was on Matthew Head's podcast talking about it, about dyslexia and autism, because I'd never done a talk about it, and I thought it'd be really interesting. So obviously I had the autistic angle covered, and I phoned my favourite dyslexic, someone who's a really engaging presenter, knows his stuff, and is massively respected in the neurodiversity community. But he wasn't available, so I phoned Martin.
I deserve that.
So we pulled this talk together, we chucked our ideas around, we decided what we were going to say and so on. And as we worked together, I realised that our differences were really helping pull this talk together. But also it was our similarities that was making it work. We have a really similar approach to how we do things. We're really passionate about neurodiversity. And we both understand where the other one is coming from. But it's not just about us two. It's about the people you can't see. I'm not talking about ghosts. I mean people who are doing all the sort of unsung hero work, who pull all this stuff together. None of this would have happened without the people who are booking meetings and organising everything and sorting our AV out and all of that. And a lot of those people are neurotypical. We cannot function without working with neurotypicals. They're a massively important part of the neurodiversity conversation. So although this story started with one autistic and one dyslexic, it ends with everyone. I'd like to distill that story down into kind of three main points. So the first one is that we recognised each other's strengths. I knew that working with a dyslexic was going to mean this presentation was a lot more visual and the data was going to be represented much more visually than if I was working on my own.
On the other hand, I knew that working with somebody with autism, an autistic individual, meant that, excuse the language slip, I knew that working with an autistic individual meant that it would be far more structured and detailed than I would have made it. This balances out, because if it had just been me, it would all have been cabbages and theology and cosmology. Whereas with Rachel, well, how do it mitigate your weaknesses?
Well, I think first of all it's important to recognise that we do have weaknesses. Those are valid, and that we do kind of mitigate each other's. I knew that if I was working on my own, the talk would be a little bit clunky and a little bit factual and maybe a little bit dry. And working with a dyslexic kind of smooths out the edges, because dyslexics can see the bigger picture. Above all, though, we empathised with each other. We understood that we were coming from very different places.
And I'd just like to say a little bit of a word about empathy. There's awful lot of rubbish talked on the internet about empathy, how you can practice empathy. The way you generate empathy, and all the research shows this, is that you get to know somebody, you get to understand that person, you get to understand that person as an individual, and you build bonds with that person. There's something happens neurologically, by the way. You build bonds with that person, and you come to feel what that person feels. And it means, by the way, that when Rachel and I were creating this, it was really smooth and there were no problems at all. And no one argued at any point. But it does mean that empathy and inclusivity is a journey rather than a skill. It's a journey. So to illustrate this journey, Rachel's going to tell us a quick story about the journey.
So I'm going to talk about the road to inclusion, and this is the last part of our talk today. Some tips for you on how to be inclusive, and I've done it as a journey, because we all like a journey metaphor, don't we? So on our journey to inclusion today, first of all, we've got a school that represents education. Then we've got a post office, which represents communication. And finally, we've got an ice cream parlour. And there's your little car, that's you on the road to inclusion. Before we start, though, we need to dump our luggage. All of us do things because they've always been done like that. And we never even think about doing it a different way. We're just like, oh yeah, we've always done it that way, so we're going to keep doing it that way. But that doesn't work for everyone. So the first thing we need to do when we're trying to be inclusive is to kind of ditch some of our ideas, ditch some of our old processes, leave those behind, and start educating ourselves, which is why we have the school. You can't be inclusive unless you understand neurodiversity, unless you know something about autism, about dyslexia, about ADHD. So where can you learn? You don't have to go to school. Most of us hated school, let's be honest. But you don't have to learn at school anymore. Where do people learn now? Well, TV is actually quite a big one. Everybody keeps asking me if I've seen Chris Packham's Inside Our Autistic Minds. And I keep telling them, I don't even want to see inside my own autistic mind, let alone anyone else's. But the thing is, that sort of program is bringing an awareness of autism to a much, much wider audience. So those things are brilliant. TV's brilliant for that. We've got books, learning online. There's a lot of good information online. There's also a lot of disinformation, so you have to be a little bit careful. Events like this one, and talking to actual people. Isn't that novel? Actually having a conversation with an autistic person, with a dyslexic person, with somebody with ADHD, can go a really long way to understanding what it's like to have one of these conditions. So next up we have the post office. The post office represents communication, and communication is the cornerstone of inclusion, because if you don't communicate effectively with each other, you just run into a whole lot of problems. Can you sing the third line of Wonderwall? Anyone? So I
don't believe that anybody feels the way I do about you now.
Yeah, so you got it now. Nobody could come straight out with that, could they? You have to do the first two lines to get to the third one. All of us need meaning and context in order to understand things, and a lot of times in order to do things. Neurodivergent people rely on meaning and context a lot more than other people. So if you want someone to do something, or you want to understand something, giving them reasons why, giving them the context, can go a really long way to helping them understand. Be clear. Obviously, as an autistic, I do love a bit of clarity. Invite people to speak. Now, we've heard this analogy that accessibility is opening the door and inclusion is inviting somebody in, right? But real inclusion goes further than that. You not only have them sit at the table, but you invite them to speak. Because a lot of neurodivergent people don't actually share their ideas or their thoughts very easily. So inviting people to speak is an important part of being truly inclusive. And by the way, hardly anyone does this. So imagine being at a meeting. You could say, oh, Jeff, did you have something to add? Or, Jeff, I know you have some really good ideas about this. You were talking about it the other day. Or, Jeff, if you've got a question, is it why is everyone in this meeting called Jeff? But actually asking people to contribute, it doesn't have to be in a meeting, in any context, is a brilliant way to be inclusive. Don't judge. I mentioned at the beginning I used to be really judgmental. That's no longer true. And again, actually talk to people. I was at an event this week and someone described it as having an adult-adult conversation. Instead of sending passive-aggressive emails or putting up little notes or, being weird about stuff, just have a conversation with someone as an adult. Tell people how you feel. Tell people what the actual problem is, because once you get to the root of the problem, you can start solving it. Finally, on our road to inclusion, we have the ice cream parlour. Yum. Now, the ice cream parlour represents having stuff ready, having stuff available. You don't go into an ice cream parlour and say, can I have a scoop of vanilla, please? And they go, yeah, you've got to get a note from your doctor and then you've got to fill in this form and we'll order it in for you and you can have it in 6 to 8 business weeks. That doesn't happen, does it? They have all the flavours available for when people want them. And you can do that too in the workplace. You can have things available. You can have a budget for assistive technology. You can have noise-cancelling headphones. You can have a flexible working policy. You can have stuff already there, ready for people who want to use it and who need to use it. And going a little bit further than that, you can offer things to people. Do you want a flake? Obviously the answer is yes. And almost nobody does this. Almost nobody offers things to neurodivergent people because they're afraid of offending us. And it should be as natural as saying, do you want a flake in your ice cream? Do you want me to leave the door open? Do you want me to start this earlier? Would that be better for you? Would you like to finish later? Would you like to have a break in the middle of this meeting? Offering things is so valuable because it's not only the thing that you offer that helps us, it's telling us that you understand us, that you've thought about it, and that you're willing to actually do something. So where does all this lead to? Well, in the workplace, it's about productivity. This graph shows that neurodivergent people are 30% more productive than their peers. That's from the Harvard Business Review. Autistic people, according to JP Chase, are 90 to 140% more productive than their peers, which is absolutely staggering. And it's not just autistics. Dyslexics too represent, is it 40%?
40% of self-made millionaires.
40% of self-made millionaires in the UK are dyslexic because of those dyslexic strengths that we talked about earlier. So what is the most important thing? We've gone over quite a lot of inclusion tips here, but what is the most important thing you absolutely,
unequivocally,
categorically,
100%
must do? Nothing. You don't have to do anything because inclusion is a choice.
Yep. And not only is inclusion a choice, but when you choose to include and when you choose to be inclusive, the things that you do are choices and they're context dependent. So when you come to a workshop or a conference and they say you must do this, and you must do this, take that with a pinch of salt. It's all contextual, it's all context dependent.
So that almost wraps us up for today. We've told you 3 things in this talk. We've told you all about autism and dyslexia. We've told you how we work together, and we've told you what we can do, what you can do to be inclusive.
So I'm going to give you one tip. This isn't something you must do, but here's one tip. We talked about empathy. I'd like you to take that piece of paper that you started with. Just pick it up and turn it over so you can see what you wrote on the other side of the piece of paper. This is something you wish people knew about you. And this is the road to empathy. And that is the road to inclusivity. So I'd like to say, if you want to start being inclusive, where we finish is where you start. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.